No country for old hormones. The War Room. Headquarters for the Anabolic Party, 3 days before the debate. The fluorescent lights in the war room had been buzzing for 16 hours straight. Empty coffee cups towered in precocious pyramid near the whiteboard. Someone had written metabolic supremacy or nothing in red marker across the top of the flip chart, and nobody had bothered to erase it. Testosterone sat at the head of the long conference table, with his arms crossed and his jaw set like a quarried stone. He was the kind of man who filled a room just by breathing in it. Thick neck, barrel chest, a permanent 5 o'clock shadow that seemed less like stubble and more like intention. He wore a fitted navy jacket with no tie, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't do ties. Ties were for hormones that needed help looking authoritative. "Run it again," he said. Campaign manager Estrogen sighed from the corner where she had been nursing a lukewarm green tea for the past 40 minutes. She was sharp and elegant, in a way most people in the room underestimated right up until the moment she destroyed them. Her silver blazer caught the light when she moved, and she moved constantly, restlessly, precise. Always 3 thoughts ahead of whatever the room was currently discussing. "We run it 6 times, Testo." "Then run it 7. "The talking points aren't the problem." She set down her mug and walked to the whiteboard, clicking the cap off a marker with practiced ease of someone who'd been winning arguments since before most people in the room existed. "The problem is you telegraph every punch. You get emotional. You go personal, and you forget that 30% of the voters in the auditorium have been taking Cortisol aside for 20 years because he sounds reasonable." Testosterone snorted. "Cortisol isn't reasonable. Cortisol is a liar." "Cortisol," Estrogen said carefully, "is a very good liar, which is a functionally different problem." Across the table, Growth Hormone leaned back in his chair, with his long legs stretched out and his hands laced behind his head. He was younger than the others, lanky, bright-eyed in the way that he hadn't been beaten out of him yet. His tie was loosened. He had a can of sparkling water and a tablet showing 6 different polling models simultaneously. "Latest numbers have us down 4 points in the recovery district," he said, without looking up. "Up 3 in the muscle corridor. Net negative among the over 40 demographic, unless we start talking about bone density." "Nobody wants to talk about bone density," Testosterone said. "Everyone over 40 secretly wants to talk about bone density," Growth Hormone replied. "They just don't want to be the one to bring it up." Estrogen capped her marker. "That's actually our opening. Stability. Longevity. This isn't about peaking performance. This is about building something that lasts." She pointed at Testosterone. "That's your closing statement. Say it exactly like that. And for the love of all things solid they are, do not improvise at the end." Testosterone shifted in his seat. "I can't just read a script." "It's not a script. It's a framework." "There's a difference." "Yes, a script is what you read. A framework is what you believe, organized so the audience can follow it." She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, leaning forward with her elbows on the table. This was her closed-in voice, the one she used when she needed him to actually hear her instead of just waiting for her to stop talking. "Cortisol is going to come in there and make everything sound like an emergency. That's what he does. He's been doing it for decades. He will tell that audience that without sustained stress response, the whole system collapses. And a lot of them will believe him because fear is the easiest story there is. And what do we tell them? We tell them the truth." She leaned back. "That short-term crisis management at the expense of long-term building is why recovery districts are suffering. That every time cortisol gets its hooks in for too long, you spend 6 months cleaning up the damage." She paused. We tell them stability isn't weakness, it's the hardest thing there is. The room was quiet for a moment. Growth Hormone looked up from his tablet. That's actually polls really well in the over 40 demo. I know, Estrogen said. She picked up her tea again. Run it again, Testo. From the top. Testosterone uncrossed his arms. He cleared his throat. He looked at the whiteboard where someone had written, metabolic supremacy or nothing. And for a long moment he seemed to be deciding whether that was still what he believed. Then he began. The education of insulin, the pancreatic burrow, 23 years earlier. The pancreatic burrow was not an easy place to grow up. The streets ran in narrow clusters between the processing facilities, and the air smelled perpetually of sugar, not the warm caramel comfort of bakeries uptown, but the sharp, chemical sweetness of industrial overflow. Glucose spilled through the gutters on bad days. On good days, there was no good days, only less bad ones. Insulin grew up in the narrow house on the corner of Receptor Row and Uptake Lane, the third of 5 children, and a household where things could change in an instant, and usually did. His father, Old Glucagon, was a tall, angular man with sharp cheekbones and a permanent look of furious urgency. He worked nights at the mobilization plant and came home in early mornings smelling of adrenaline and fatigue. And the unspoken rule of the household was that you didn't disturb him before noon unless you were prepared to deal with the consequences. The consequences were loud. The consequences left marks that weren't always visible. Up, Glucagon would snap, appearing in the kitchen doorway when the children had barely finished breakfast. You think resources just appear? You think the body owes you a comfortable morning? Insulin, age 7, would push his chair back and say nothing. He had learned earlier that saying nothing was the safest response, that compliance was survival, and the best way to avoid the storm was to anticipate it. His mother, quiet and effective, moved through the house like a woman who had organized her entire personality around reducing friction. She distributed what was needed, absorbed what she could, and smiled in a way that was never quite reached her eyes. She told Insulin once, tucking him during a rare night of calm, that his job was going to be important someday. You're going to be the one who lets things in, she said, soothing her hair. Most people keep doors locked. You're going to be the one who opens them. He didn't know what that meant at 7. At 12, when he first understood the mechanics of what he was for, he thought he understood. He opened the cellular doors. He managed the flow. He was the one who made sure energy got there it needed to go. It seemed like an honorable job, an essential job. What nobody told him was how exhausting it would be to spend your entire life responding to other people's chaos. By adolescence, Insulin had developed what the school counselor called an anxious disposition, what everyone else in the borough called being wound too tight. He was reactive. He was alert in the way someone who had never fully learned to stop bracing. A sharp noise in the hallway, and his whole system spiked. A change in routine, and he overcompensated, overshot, ended up apologizing for the resulting crash. Glucose, who lived 3 streets over and was the most effortlessly popular person in their grade, called Insulin twitchy. This wasn't meant as an insult, but Insulin carried it quietly, the way you carry a word that is unkind but not entirely wrong. It was Miss Lapis, his chemistry teacher in the 9th grade, who finally said something useful. She kept him after class for one afternoon, absently over a lab report, but actually, Insulin would realize much later, because she had been paying attention. You know why you're good at your job? She asked, not looking up from her desk as she marked papers. I'm not sure I am, Insulin said. You are. You're fast. You're thorough. You notice things that other kids miss. She looked up then. She had the no-nonsense directness of someone who had watched too many bright children and convinced themselves that they were broken. The problem isn't your capability. The problem is that you've learned to operate in emergency mode as a default state, and emergency mode is not sustainable. He thought about his father, about the mornings on Receptor Row. What do I do about it? He asked. You practice, she said, simply. You learn to tell the difference between a real crisis and the habit of fear. That's all it is, you know. Most of what sends you into overdrive, it's a habit, a learned response. It feels like an emergency because it always felt like an emergency. She went back to remarking, it isn't always. Insulin walked home that afternoon through the narrow streets of Pancreatic Borough, watching the glucose drift in the gutters, thinking about the habits and emergencies and the distance between them. He wasn't sure at 15 that he believed her. He would spend the next 20 years finding out. The Other Side, Stress Response Coalition campaign office, 2 days before the debate. Cortisol's office smelled like burnt espresso and manufactured urgency, which is inappropriate because both of those things were Cortisol's natural habitat. He was pacing when his communications director, Adrenaline, arrived at 7 in the morning. Cortisol was always pacing. He was a lean, restless man with darting eyes and a talent for making any room he occupied feel slightly smaller and slightly more pressurized than it had been before when he walked in. You saw the polling? Adrenaline said, dropping her bag in the nearest chair. She was wiry and fast and always slightly breathless, generating a static energy that made sensitive equipment malfunction and nervous people more nervous. I saw the polling, Cortisol saw. 4 points. Momentum metrics. Recovery districts. He waved a hand. It's a bounce. That's all it is. Anytime testosterone runs a soft-focused stability message, it generates a short-term bump in voters who forgot what the world actually looks like. And what does the world actually look like? Cortisol stopped pacing and fixed her with a look. Dangerous, he said. The world looks exactly like it always has. Dangerous and unpredictable and completely uninterested in whether anyone is having a comfortable morning. He resumed pacing. Our message hasn't changed because the reality hasn't changed. Without stress response, without appropriate mobilization, the entire system becomes complacent. And complacency kills. Adrienne sat down and pulled out her tablet. The focus groups flagged the word complacency again. It reads as condescending. Good. They should feel condescended to. They're being complacent. Cortisol? She used the tone that was meant for when you need to hear me, not just wait for me to finish. He paused. The voters who have drifted to the anabolic party aren't complacent. They're tired. There's a difference. They've been in emergency mode for a long time, and it's cost them something, and they're looking for a candidate who acknowledges that cost. A long pause. Cortisol turned to face the window. Outside, the early morning traffic of the Body Politic moved in its usual patterns. Purposeful, hurried, slightly anxious. I know, it cost something, he said, quietly. That was different, Cortisol. A register he developed rarely, and only when there was no cameras. I've always known it, but without the alarm system, without the mobilization response, the threats don't wait. The blood sugar crashes, infection spreads, the predator catches the prey. He turned back. I'm not the villain in this story. I'm just the one who does the job that no one wants to acknowledge as necessary. Adrenaline looked at him for a long moment. Then say that, she said. Say exactly that tomorrow night, and you might actually win. Cortisol straightened his jacket. The moment closed over like water over stone. The pacing resumed. Draft me 3 opening statements, he said. Escalating urgency, and find out who testosterone is planning to lead with. And if it's the growth hormone doing his longevity and bone density routine again, I want to counter ready. Already on it, Adrenaline said. Get me an espresso. You've had 4. Then get me a 5th. This is not a low cortisol situation. She left without pointing out the irony of the statement, which was, Cortisol thought, one of the things he generally liked about her. The debate. The Grand Hypothalamus Auditorium. Debate night. The auditorium seated 3,000, and Every seat was filled. The crowd was a cross-section of the whole body politic. Immune cells in their white clusters, cardiovascular workers in their red-stained work clothes, neurotissue delegates in the upper tiers looking down on the detached interest of people who processed everything and felt nothing publicly. Their recovery district had sent a large contingent, identified by their fatigue and their cautious, watchful quiet. Moderator Thyroid took the stage to scattered applause. She was composed and unhurried in a way of someone who had regulated everyone else's pace for a living, and the room settled quickly under the weight of her presence. "Welcome," she said. "Tonight's debate will cover energy management, crisis response, long-term infrastructure, and the question of what kind of body politic we want to be. Each candidate will have an opening statement, followed by direct questions, followed by a closing statement." She looked at the two podiums. "We will begin with opening statements. Mr. Cortisol?" Cortisol stepped forward. He was good. That was the thing about Cortisol. Whatever you thought of his politics, he was generally formidably good at this. He gripped the podium with both hands and looked at the auditorium with the focused intensity of a man who believed completely in what he was about to say, which was either admirable or tirelessly depending on your perspective. 3 years ago, he began. The eastern membrane was breached. 14 cellular districts went into crisis. The immune response was slow. The inflammatory cascade was under-resourced, and the recovery took 8 months. He paused. He let the silence do its work. "My opponent talks about stability. Stability is a luxury. Stability is what you get when you have the threats aren't real. The threats are always real, and when they come, you want a system that's been trained to respond, not a system that's spent 12 years optimizing for comfort." The recovery district contingent shifted in their seats. Cortisol leaned forward. "I'm not running for office to make you feel good. I'm running for office because feeling good and being safe are not the same thing, and someone in this building has to be willing to say so." Applause, genuine, if not universal. The cardiovascular workers were on their feet. Some of the immune cells, a scattered few from the upper tiers. Thyroid let the room settle. "Mr. Testosterone?" Testosterone walked to the podium. He had estrogen's framework in his head and his own nature in his chest, and the distance between those two things had been worked on for 3 days. He looked at the auditorium. He found the recovery district contingent and held their gaze for a moment. "My opponent is right about one thing," he said. "The eastern membrane crisis was a failure. It was a failure of infrastructure, a failure of long-term investment." He let that land. "But do you know what preceded the eastern membrane crisis? 14 months of sustained stress mobilization with no recovery window. 14 months of cortisol saturation that degraded the very immune function it was supposed to support. The membrane didn't breach because we were too relaxed. The membrane breached because we were too exhausted." The recovery district contingent was very still. "I know what it costs," Testosterone said, "to be in emergency mode indefinitely. I know what it takes from you. And I'm telling you, the answer is not more of what broke us. The answer is building something strong enough that we don't have to be afraid all the time." The applause was slower to start, but it was broader when it came. Thyroid asked about the Glucose Regulation Act. Cortisol said deregulation created flexibility in crisis scenarios. Testosterone said deregulation created volatility that manufactured crisis where none had existed. The audience tracks the exchange with focused energy of people who had heard versions of this argument all their lives and were trying to decide which version to believe. Insulin, sitting in the third row of the recovery district contingent, watched cortisol with the particular attention of someone who had grown up with cortisol at the kitchen table. He recognized the urgency, the genuine conviction, the inability to modulate because modulation felt like surrender. He was not unsympathetic. He had been that person. He understood the bone-deep exhaustion of a world that required you to be ready for the worst at every moment, and the way that exhaustion could calcify into ideology. The difference was somewhere between receptor row and the auditorium. Insulin had learned from Mrs. La Paz, had tried to teach him at 15. that most emergencies are habits, that the alarm system doesn't know the difference between a real threat and the memory of one, that sustainability was not a weakness word, it was the hardest kind of strength. He thought about his mother's hands and his hair. You're going to be the one who opens the doors. He thought about what it meant to be let things in, not recklessly, not without care, but with deliberate, practiced decision to build something permanent enough to receive nourishment and strong enough to maintain its own shape while doing it. In the fourth quarter of the debate, Thyro asked the closing question. What does a healthy body politic look like in 20 years? Cortisol said, vigilant, responsive, never caught unprepared. Testosterone paused for a moment before he answered, and then he said, strong enough not to be afraid. The recovery district contingent rose first, then the neural tears, then slowly, section by section, the rest of the auditorium. Not unanimous, the cardiovascular workers stayed seated, and several immune cells delegated across their arms, but the broader than any polling model had predicted. Estrogen, standing in the wings, watched the room and did not allow herself to feel anything until the numbers confirmed it. Adrenaline, standing in the opposite wings, texted Cortisol a single word, tomorrow. Cortisol, still at the podium, looked out at the standing crowd with an expression that was hard to read. Not defeated exactly, more like the face of a man who has been doing a necessary job for a very long time and has just received the first credible suggestion that someone else might be willing to share the weight. He straightened his jacket. He gathered his notes. He walked off stage. The body, for a moment, was very quiet. Then it went back to doing what bodies do. The blood moving, cells dividing, the endless metabolic commerce of being alive. And the debate became history. And history became the present. And the present, as it always does, began immediately to negotiate in terms with the future.